You're about to view an episode of Sites on EdTech, Zanichelli Venture's interview series with people from the education technologies world. I am your host, Luigi Morino, and in this episode I interviewed Jin Yun Chow, COO of Polygence, an EdTech platform facilitating project-based learning for high school kids by pairing them with expert research mentors to work on personalized research projects. Here is the interview. I'm very happy to be speaking to Jin today. Thank you for joining us, Jin.
Hi, Luigi. Thank you so much for having me.
So could you please explain what Polygence is?
Absolutely. So Polygence, so I'll first start with the word. So Polygence has two parts to it. There's poly, which is the Greek root for many or multiple. And then gens is sort of what we've taken from the word intelligence. And so our name stands for multiple intelligences, and that's really at the core of our philosophy, essentially. We are an EdTech platform where we pair high schoolers with expert research mentors, whether they're grad students, postdocs, industry professionals, to work on personalized research projects. And the reason why we're poly in terms of for various and diverse is that we don't only do research projects in STEM. We also support students in social sciences, in the humanities, and creative arts. And we really encourage our students to explore the world via, a multitude of different lenses. So that's in a nutshell what Polygence is.
Okay, what kind of projects then? Can you get a little more specific?
Absolutely. So when people think about the word research, they typically think, like white lab coats, pipetting, beakers, Bunsen burners, like very hands-on and sort of science-oriented research. But at Polygence, another kind of diversity that we really celebrate is producing all kinds of different final outputs, not just research papers, not just experiment results, but all kinds of creative outputs. I'll give some examples of some of our most creative and also academic projects. So one of our students worked with a music composer and music theory mentor to write and produce a love song. And in the demo later, I'll just show a little bit more about that project. But in this project, the student, studied music theory, worked on analyzing various love songs, understanding pop music theory, and wrote his own love song and produced it and learned mixing and editing and all that. So that's one. A more academic example might be, we recently had a student write a long form research article about an invasive species of iguanas in South Florida. South Florida is where the student is from. And they noticed that there were a lot of these iguanas and started doing a lot of research into invasive species, ecosystems, etc., and then wrote this long form research paper. Really cool. We also had a student work on a podcast on a topic that is very near and dear to her heart, which is skin problems and skin disease and mental health. So how having skin problems, whether it's eczema or other kinds of problems, affect mental health of teenagers. And she produced a podcast series where she interviewed people, talked about literature, psychology, and skin disease together, and then produced this really awesome podcast.
Can we have the name of the podcast?
The name of the podcast is Skin Mental Health. I'm also gonna just double check. Oh, I think it's called Mind the Skin. There we go.
Mind the Skin, is it?
Yes, and it's gonna be available on Apple Podcasts and also on Spotify. Mind the Skin. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and one more example I'll just give actually that's very relevant is we had a student publish an op-ed article about the fraught relationship between the Putin regime and Russian youths. And so lots of different kinds of projects and topics.
Yeah. So what age bracket are we talking about? You said high school. Are we just talking about senior high school or really any age bracket in high school?
Yeah, the majority of our students are, I would say, 9th grade to 12th grade, so 14 to 18, although occasionally we do also have younger students. 7th, 8th graders come to us as well.
Wow. What kind of projects do they engage in?
The younger students, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of our younger students work on creative projects, so creative writing. Some of them do art projects with us. some of our very precocious young students will do, like simpler computer science projects like building a game or building their own website. Yeah, and we have mentors reserved who have had experience working with younger students for that population.
Speaking about mentors, can you tell a little bit about Polygence mentors? Who are they? How do you choose them?
Absolutely.
How do you pick them? And how do students pick? Or is it students picking the mentor? How does it work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really good question. So our mentors, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of them right now, and we have over 1,000 on our platform, are graduate students. So people who are currently pursuing their PhDs or masters or postdocs, and in some way or form associated with institutions. We also have a smaller number of what we call industry professionals. So people, let's say, who are entrepreneurs or people who are practicing lawyers, people who are working in finance, who also have a passion for teaching and for education, who are teaching with us. Our vetting process for mentors is pretty rigorous. So we have a 2-step interview process with every mentor. And then we also, of course, run federal background checks before pairing them with any student. In terms of the matching, that's our secret sauce. Like the way that we are able to match a student given their very specific interests with the perfect kind of mentor is sort of what we pride ourselves in. Students do not pick mentors. So they apply with an idea of what they want to do, maybe a topic or a research question if they have that already. And then we look through our entire database of mentors, looking at who's available, looking at personality fit to find the perfect one for the student.
Wow, okay. So you're telling us a little bit about your secret sauce, but not disclosing everything about it.
No,
you told
it's also technology enabled, which is part of the secret sauce, but yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned the projects that younger students engage in, which is really cool that you're engaging with this population as well, and not just the population that is getting closer to university. But let's talk a little about the more academic side of the kids that are doing projects with Polygence. You have kids who've been published, who have presented at conferences. What can you tell us about some of those projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our kids, because especially if they're later in high school, what they want is something that is showcaseable and tangible that they can either append to their college applications or append to some kind of scholarship application or internship application. And so having something that's external and having some kind of external recognition, whether it's conference or publications, is important to a lot of our older students. So in terms of what kinds of conferences, like we actually organize our own high school conference called the Symposium of Rising Scholars. That happens biannually, and the next one will be on March 26th. There we invite some of our alumni and students who are very near the end of their project to present their work in front of a panel of experts, learn how to write an abstract, submit one, work on slides. So they get some experience there. And then there we also have conference prizes for best poster, best elevator pitch, that kind of thing. Other kinds of conferences.
Do you accept, by the way, sorry, in your own conference, do you accept external students presenting, or is it just Polygence graduates?
Good question. The vision is in the future, we want to be able to accept any kid who has a project they want to present. Right now, just because we're starting to build it out, it's only Polygence students, but anyone is free to attend and connect with them and learn.
Right.
Yeah. Another example would be, we had a student who co-authored a paper with her mentor on computational linguistics. This is a very advanced project on essentially gender bias in media representation of some political candidates. And that was presented at the Association of Computational Linguistics conference, which is a graduate conference, but had a section for non-graduates, essentially. We've also had students apply and get into Regeneron Science Fair and Scholar, the talent search. That project was a psychology project on the coping mechanisms for COVID-19 and mental health repercussions of the pandemic. Lots of projects around COVID, sort of from all angles, which is very interesting.
Of course.
Yeah.
And what have you observed in university applications? Does it really help kids? I imagine it does, but what have you observed?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely helps, especially with the current trend of moving away from standardized testing. I mean,
Yes.
back in 2020, the UCs completely dropped SATs and ACTs, and now there's a whole wave of colleges. I think now over 1,800 accredited universities have made it optional. With something like that, schools are looking for other ways of distinguishing exceptional students. And students who are able to showcase their interests and talents through something independent, like a research project or a creative piece, will stand out. But I think one of our sort of core missions too is, yes, we understand that that is always a priority and that is something that students will be thinking about, but we don't want that to be the only reason you come to Polygence. And even if it is the only reason you come to Polygence, we want you to leave Polygence with more than just a resume line. We want you to have fallen in love with whatever it is you've been working on. So that's our secret agenda.
You touched upon a very important and big topic at the moment, very contemporary, about shifting away from standardized testing, even for university entries. In a big part, it reflects how universities are changing and adapting to the times at the moment. What is your take on this, since you yourself made it into Ivy League and big name universities before this shift actually happened? So what's your take? By the way, you were doing your PhD at Stanford, and before that, where did you do your bachelor's, and did you do a master's?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Princeton, and then after that, I went straight to Stanford to do my PhD. And my current status is I'm on leave to work full-time on Polygence from the PhD at Stanford. No, that's a really good question. Sometimes I think back to when I was applying, and like, if I were a high schooler now, like, would I still have a chance of getting into these universities? Like, I really don't know. But I think it's both a blessing and a curse, this whole test optional thing, because I think it places the emphasis on obviously these kinds of independent opportunities, and students who are able to find these opportunities and do research. But at the same time, obviously, it heavily favors students who either have some kind of training in asking their research questions and is able to either participate in programs or get scholarships to do so. And I think because high school systems are still very far away from being the kind of project-based independent inquiry type sort of playground, it's a tall order to expect students to be able to like have that initiative. And that's part of why I thought it was such an important initiative to start something like Polygence, to bring the kind of independent thinking earlier into the student's education. Because if you think about it, it really isn't until grad school that a student is asked, like, what are you interested in studying? Or like, what questions are you interested in answering? So moving
with the exception of a few particular education systems, such as Montessori schools or Waldorfs, or
IB,
IB in high school, yes, for sure. That's the one you took in high school, right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, yeah, in IB, you have the extended essay, which is basically a baby thesis that you have to work on. And so you get that training earlier. But really, I think the earlier, the better, right? Like, yeah.
Let's delve a little bit into the project-based learning topic. Do you think that that is the future of education? Do you think that we need to include it more in education, but we shouldn't overdo it? And first, let's tackle it on a more generic sense, and then let's bring it back to Polygence. And I'll ask you about what your vision is about what can Polygence do to make that vision reality, even in formal and in-school education.
Yeah, I absolutely think project-based learning will be the future of education. That's not to say that I think it will completely replace all kinds of traditional book learning, but I definitely think that the best way for students to learn any kind of material is through applied means. And what that means is to not learn the knowledge and theories in the abstract. And some students might find that exciting and might work for some students, but I think for the majority, being able to apply, whether it's formula that they're learning or philosophical theories or, you know, literary works, being able to apply that in tangible situations in their own lives will be, I think, much more impactful in terms of both knowledge absorption as well as understanding and being able to connect the dots. And I think, obviously, in order to get there, we need many more teachers. We need teachers. We need the teaching industry to be much more well paid and well funded, because part of why that's so hard to implement now is that no matter where you are in the world, really, with the exception of, you know, private schools that have a lot of funding, the class sizes are huge, right? Like in Hong Kong, where I'm from, in a regular public school, it might be one teacher in a classroom of 35 to 40 kids. Like project-based learning cannot happen there when you have the teacher to student ratio is so low. And so I definitely think it is the better way for students to learn, and also a much better way for students to gain interpersonal skills that they otherwise wouldn't gain in terms of working with each other, working in groups, delegation, time management, like communication, all these skills that are so important but aren't explicitly taught in high school.
Okay, now tell us what your vision is for Polygence to play its role in this change.
Yeah, so we see Polygence as at the forefront of this educational movement, and we want Polygence to not only be sort of the go-to platform after school that kids can, you know, do projects on. We want to get into schools, meaning we want Polygence to be sort of integrated into school curricula, maybe in schools where there aren't enough resources to hire the kinds of experts, or there are students who want to do projects that aren't able to be supported by the school. We sort of foresee Polygence going into classrooms, supplementing teaching, especially in this era of online learning, where a lot of schools, I think for better or for worse, like because of COVID, will continue this kind of hybrid model, or at least have waves of hybridity. I think that, you know, the long-term vision is for Polygence to be a core curricular offering in schools globally.
Do you think that targeting micro schools is an option to bridge this kind of ultimate vision with the extracurricular main business that you are at right now?
Yeah, for sure. I think working with micro schools, and also we've had some discussions with smaller private schools where there's right now, obviously, the funding and the bandwidth to think about these kinds of integrations. We actually have one pilot that's going on with a school in North Carolina where we have a couple of our mentors going in via Zoom to the honors biology class, the 9th grade honors biology class, to facilitate like a semester-long project with groups of students. And so I think obviously working with schools too, whether it's micro schools or larger independent or public schools, group projects will become the norm rather than our flagship one-on-one experience. And so in terms of thinking about our product and diversification, as we're figuring out what kind of product works for schools, the group element will be very important.
Right, and you mentioned biology, which leads me to ask you about projects that are regarding chemistry, physics, biology, potentially that might require experiments and potentially labs. How are you going about that right now? Have you had projects that would require a lab, and is there a possibility for students to what have you arranged? Do they meet up with mentors? How are you going about this?
Yeah, so I will say actually a lot of our students are very interested in experimental work, whether it's, you know, mechanical engineering, they want to build something, or biology, chemistry, they want to run their own experiments. And it's true that our mentors are oftentimes on the other side of the country, or, you know, on the other side of the world from the student. And so no, our students don't typically meet up with their mentors in person, but that does not preclude physical or hands-on experiments from being done. And I'll give you two examples. We had one student who was a microbiology student, very interested in sort of like gut, like digestive microbiome health. And in particular, she's interested in the gut health of her guinea pig, her pet at home. And so what she did is she bought these agar plates and culture dishes from Amazon. Over Zoom, she learned from the mentor how to culture bacteria. And then she took the feces of the guinea pig and she cultured bacteria in her own home from essentially the poop of her guinea pig, and learned how to observe sort of bacterial cultural growth. She didn't have a microscope, but she was able to do a lot of sort of like measurements, for example, of each bacterial colony. And that turned into a really awesome sort of like at-home experiment. This was like during the height of COVID when like school wasn't even, not even hybrid, it was like fully online. And she ended up presenting at our symposium on her findings and what she learned about how to observe bacteria. And another example would be, we had a student who developed, so this student is really interesting. So he, one of his chores at home, he lives in Michigan, is to shovel the snow out of the driveway. And he wanted to do a hands-on project, mechanical engineering project, that would develop a machine that can shovel and melt the snow for him.
Nice.
And that is exactly his project. And if you'll let me, I'm going to share my screen and just show you.
Yeah, please do.
This is one of our project pages. And so this is the student, his name is Yusuf. And this is the thing he created and the shoveling that happened in his home. And it's actually a very nifty device. It's an automatic device. It uses Arduinos and sensors to melt snow whenever it senses that there is snow, I guess, under it. And he's produced it using, 3 different ways to clear snow off of driveways. And he even patented it to name it the auto melter. And then wrote a paper about his experience, the tech involved in creating this project. And then he also presented it at our symposium, and he actually won the most innovative project award. And so this is just to show that, like, obviously it's not ideal that like the mentor isn't in the same place and can't help them with certain hands-on things, but I actually think it fosters a lot more independence because the student is on their own in terms of like the actual building of the product.
Yeah, this is very impressive. I'm wondering whether Polygence students have ever actually developed something that became into a startup and had a go-to-market. Maybe not yet, but has it happened?
We've had students build businesses. Obviously, I think it's still too young and small to see where it could go, but we've had students develop their own clothing line, for example, or like start nonprofits online with their mentors. And then who knows, maybe in a few years, like the auto melter will be on the market and we'll be able to buy it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds quite promising. You've illustrated many of the projects from Polygence, and it was fun to check out this project. Do you have any other material that you would like to share from other projects? Yeah,
absolutely. Let me just share my screen again.
Yeah.
I'll maybe go over some of the impressive projects that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, this project, Starry Night, a Love Song, is the song that I was mentioning before. And for all of our projects, usually if we get the students' approval, people can click into it and read the paper or listen to the song, and I'll just play a little bit. Starry night, fresh and past by, here we lie under the painting sky. A hidden natural ride into my world at night. So this is just an example of the song mixing student who learned about music theory and then wrote a love song and then produced it at home with his mentor, who's a music and composer mentor. And this is just our projects page where we basically showcase a lot of our different alumni projects and where students can go and listen to their podcasts and whatever. So this is the podcast that I was telling you about called Mind the Skin, hosted by Audrey. and you can listen to it by clicking
Yeah.
on.
I'm sure several of our listeners are going to go check out some of the projects that have been developed.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a few business questions now. We've talked a lot about Polygence's product. So what stage of your business are you at? Have you raised investments? And if so, yes, how many people are in your team? And so on. Classic questions.
Yeah. So we are almost 3 years old now. We started in 2019. We've raised pre-seed and a seed round. And we went from just me and my co-founder, Janos, to now 26 full-time employees, and we're hiring as we speak. This quarter, one of our goals is to bring a certain number of people onto the team. And we are a fully remote team. So we have our engineering team in Hungary mostly, and then our operational team is spread out all over the US with like 5-6 people in the Bay Area where we're headquartered.
Wow, okay, cool. And how about pricing? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I can totally tell you how much our program costs. So right now, right now our program, our flagship 10 session experience, so 10 1-hour mentorship experience is $2,500 US. We do also have a financial aid program for students from low-income families, and as well as a number of pro bono partnerships with NGOs and schools. And the idea in the future is obviously to diversify the product so that there's maybe a shorter program that's more affordable, but also more flexible for students who can't commit, 10 sessions of time, as well as maybe a longer program for students who know maybe they're on the younger side and they know they want to work on something longer term. But right now, sort of our core offering is the 10 sessions.
Yeah, let's talk about the development that's in the pipeline at the moment, since to me, your product offering is a quite understandable one. It's easy to grasp, and at the same time, it has a strong potential for impact already on its own. So are you focusing more on trying to get Polygence to as many kids as possible, perhaps making a couple of adjustments as the ones you were mentioning, or are you also thinking about big product differentiations? You did mention that you have a pilot in schools at the moment. So how are you balancing this? What have you decided?
Yeah, I definitely think that we're laser focused on the core product offering and making sure that we are able to get the 10 session experience into as many kids' hands as possible. With the school pilots, school sales take so long, right? Like in terms of like getting into districts and getting even into individual schools. We're working on that sort of like as these opportunities arise, but we're not focusing a ton of energy on it. Obviously still keeping those conversations open because of how long the sales cycle typically is in terms of like figuring things out with schools and budgets and all of that. But I will say that the majority of our team is very focused on the core offering. And in the past, we've toyed with the idea of like, should we start offering, a shorter program to see, what the traction would be like? And we started collecting interest, but we never actually diverted resources to building it out because there was still so much work to be done and so much to learn from the 10 session experience.
Right. You mentioned the difficulty of getting into schools. It's a topic that has been discussed, the big changes that are happening in EdTech led by market mechanisms and schools falling behind and not keeping up with the changes that are going on in great part fueled by the private sector. What do you think has to change for schools to more easily adopt what is coming out of the EdTech markets? Do you think that it is going to be an adaptation of schools, or do you think that phenomena like micro schools and private schools are going to take over more and more of a, let's call, market share of the whole education population, or the whole student population?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I see traditional schooling going anywhere anytime soon, but I do think I see already a strong desire to adapt. And I don't blame how slowly things do move, especially in times of a pandemic when there are probably budgetary constraints, when parents are probably really stressed out, and there's just so much that the school has to deal with logistically to make hybrid learning a reality. But I think in general, I've sensed a general willingness and openness to just engage in conversations, even if they don't go anywhere at the very beginning, because I think because of the forced shift to online learning due to COVID, there's just been so much more sort of confrontation with technology and having to adopt Zoom sessions and interactive virtual learning or VR or AR type learning resources. And so I think, for better or for worse, like a lot of schools, even the most traditional ones, are forced with this new reality. I don't know how fast they will sort of be willing to adapt, because I mean, what I've seen is even the most well-funded elite schools have a lot of trouble making that mental shift. But I do sense that shift is happening, but probably slower than we'd all like.
What do you think about the changes that happened during COVID? Do you think they are there to stay, or do you think systems are already starting to go back to exactly what it was like before and couldn't wait to go back before? On this particular question, I think different systems, what I've been observing, different systems around the world are experiencing this differently. Some have adopted some changes a little bit more, but for example, in Italy, there's been a fierce debate on especially on behalf of the EdTech ecosystem that exists, which is trying to communicate to the general public, hey, the Zoom remote lessons is not what remote learning is really like. That's taking all the pedagogy and putting it on a desktop, and that's not good. We've never supported this and thought that this would be a great pedagogical method. Then again, that is what happened for the great majority of teachers. Hence, they can't wait to go back to exactly what it was like before COVID. So what's your take on this? Do you think they're going to revert completely, or do you think something is there to stay?
I definitely think a lot of it is to stay, especially in education for older students. So I would say probably in the US, like high school, but like teenage years. I think the online aspect for younger students is probably more controversial, / the beneficial impact is a little harder to prove, just because of attention spans, competency with technology, and sort of like technology being distracting for some of younger learners. But I think in high school learning, there's definitely been so many new developments that schools are latching onto and now becoming sort of indispensable in their own teaching. I mean, Zoom is a really great example of this, but also I think a lot of other interactive video lessons. There's been so much content that's been created since COVID that schools are using. There's stuff like Polygence. So I think there's definitely a lot of supplementary virtual materials that will be there to stay, even if and when we do go back to fully in person. And I will say too that I think in a lot of countries, there's been a huge back and forth, right? It started off completely in person and then completely virtual, and then they maybe went back a little bit, and then now there's Omicron, and then they're back to completely being virtual. And so I think that flexibility in being able to switch on and off between in person and virtual is something that will hopefully be there to stay.
Let me ask you a slightly sensitive question. Let's hear a little bit about your marketing strategies and marketing campaign. How does Polygence reach to its audience the best, and how do you get new clients, new students?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think because of the kind of value that we're offering for students and also for educators, we've seen educators, whether it's teachers, college counselors, just really help us spread the word in teaching organizations. There are lots of these conferences that have to do with that where teachers gather. And so word of mouth and through sort of being a great value add to some of these teachers have really helped us spread the word around those educator communities. And then also by now, we've seen so many sort of word of mouth, student to student referrals as well. Just because students talk about what they're doing outside of school. And if they're really excited about their project, they tell their friends about us, and their friends tell other friends. And so I think word of mouth in these kinds of education communities, whether it's parents, educators, counselors, and students, have been just really amazing for our marketing purposes. Yeah, and now we're experimenting with reaching younger generations through social media and stuff, but that's upcoming.
The conference that you're organizing is both a great addition to your product offering, but also a great chance to do some marketing, of course.
Absolutely.
How about international? Do you have, can you tell what percentage or something about how many international students you have outside the US, and how you reach them and why they come to Polygence?
Yeah, international students represent a very small fraction of our total student body. I actually don't even have the percentage off the top of my head, but the vast majority is from the US. We actually don't and haven't really done much marketing outside the US educator and student market, just because there's so many students in the US. We want to focus on one region at a time. But what's interesting is actually we did start with students from Asia, because that's where I was from. That's where I had a lot of connections. And so our very early students were Asian, Hong Kong, Chinese students. But by now it's majority US. I will say most of them find us really just by looking on Google. Like by now, if you look on Google, like high school research mentorship projects, we're probably one of the first things that come up. A lot of these students either work with college counselors who who specialize in US admissions. And so this kind of standing out with independent projects becomes more important. And so that's typically how they find us.
Sure. So you've spoken about kids who are in high school and through Polygence are developing mechanized solutions to clear the way in front of their front door. You've spoken about kids publishing in journals or presenting in conferences when they're 16, 17. Are traditional schools dumbing down kids by having them sit down at a desk and having to ask permission to go to the bathroom when these kids are already self-sufficient enough to build a robot or a mechanized solution to clear snow away from their garden? What's your take on this?
I don't know if they're dumbing it down for kids, but it's definitely a kind of learning style that only a very small population of kids respond well to. So I think it's less that they're treating kids in a way. Well, I definitely think traditional school systems don't treat kids as adults, which I think actually we should treat all students as adults. But I think there is a small population of students that I think would really thrive in that kind of learning environment. And actually I'm one of them. Like I love book learning. I'm very good at rote learning. I don't know if that's because I grew up in that system, but it's something that really appeals to me.
Well, you didn't really grow up in that system, right? Because you did IB and you went to an international school. So
yeah, that's true. But in terms of thinking through, I mean, rote learning in terms of but before IB, obviously a lot of the sort of classic textbook learning with larger classes, I have had experiences with those. And I think that I wasn't the type of kid who couldn't sit still, really needed a lot of hands-on learning. I'm not a hands-on learner. I'm a very text-based learner. And I think that, that works for some students, but I think not for a wide majority. And I think what schools would need to do is have a diversity of different kinds of learning modes to support different kinds of students.
Yeah, I was the hands-on type, so I did not thrive on an awful lot of textbooks. A few selected ones I did enjoy, but all right. Let me end with asking you, what should we be looking out for in Polygence? Do you have any announcements, and what's coming up that we should keep an eye on?
Definitely our upcoming symposium. Everyone is invited, investors, families, parents, adults, college students, everyone. I can send you the link afterwards and you can share it with everyone. It's a free event. You can come to all presentations. We have a really cool keynote speaker, Dr. Seema Yasmin, who's a epidemiologist from Stanford and a public intellectual, who'll be giving sort of us a take on how she fell in love with research. So.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, please do definitely send over the link. It was really pleasant and nice and fun to chat to you today, Jin. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.